It was a legendary escape from a place that was supposed to be inescapable. 55 years ago this month, three men pulled off the impossible, breaking out of Alcatraz.
For 63 years, three men have haunted the edge of American memory. Not as ghosts exactly, more like a question that refuses to close. On a black June night in 1962, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin slipped out of the most secure prison the federal government had ever built, paddled into one of the coldest, most violent stretches of water on the West Coast, and vanished. No bodies. No confirmed sighting. No closure. Just a raincoat raft, a scattering of debris, and a silence that has lasted longer than most human lives. Now, in 2025, that silence has finally been disturbed. A convergence of forensic reanalysis, updated title science, and quietly reopened federal files has produced something the case has never had before: a coherent, evidence-backed account of what likely happened after those three men disappeared into the dark. It isn't a confession. It isn't a body pulled from the bay. But for the first time, investigators are no longer guessing in the dark, they're working from data. And what that data suggests is going to unsettle everyone who assumed this case was ancient history. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand not just how three inmates broke out of an escape-proof island, but why it took over 6 decades, and a small army of scientists, to finally get close to the truth. Before you can understand the escape, you have to understand the place. Alcatraz Island sits a little over a mile off the San Francisco shoreline, close enough that on a clear day you can watch the city go about its business, and far enough that the distance itself became a kind of psychological weapon. The island had already lived several lives before it became a federal penitentiary, a military fort, a Civil War-era garrison, an army stockade, but it was in 1934 that it took on the identity that made it infamous. The Bureau of Prisons converted it into a maximum security, minimum privilege institution, built specifically to house men who had already proven they couldn't be controlled anywhere else. This wasn't a prison for first offenders or petty criminals. Alcatraz was where the system sent its failures: men who had escaped from other institutions, incited riots, or simply proven too dangerous to manage. The cell house itself, finished in the early 1910s under military ownership and later hardened by the Bureau, was engineered with a paranoid level of detail. Narrow, tiered cell blocks. Gun galleries positioned above the walkways so armed guards could look down on everyone below. Multiple daily head counts. Inmates were counted so often that losing track of a single prisoner should have been almost impossible. The guard-to-inmate ratio was among the tightest in the federal system. But the real genius of Alcatraz wasn't the steel or the surveillance. It was the water. San Francisco Bay around the island runs cold, typically in the low to mid-50s Fahrenheit, and its currents are shaped by a complicated tidal exchange between the bay and the open Pacific. Even strong swimmers in ideal conditions can be pulled far off course, and hypothermia sets in fast in water that cold. For nearly 3 decades, that water did more to keep men on the island than any wall. Of the roughly 3 dozen inmates who attempted escape during Alcatraz's operational years, the official record shows almost all were recaptured or killed in the attempt, with a handful presumed to have drowned. Nobody had ever been confirmed to make it off the island and disappear. That perfect record was the whole point. Alcatraz wasn't just holding dangerous men, it was broadcasting a message to every prisoner in the federal system: there is nowhere left to run. And it worked, right up until 3 men decided to test that message one more time. If you want to understand how the myth of Alcatraz finally cracked, you have to start with the mind of Frank Morris. Morris wasn't a hardened killer or a chaotic offender. He was something the prison system found far more dangerous: patient, methodical, and brilliant. Orphaned young and shuffled through foster care and juvenile institutions for most of his childhood, Morris grew up learning to rely only on himself. By his teenage years he was already committing crimes, and by adulthood he had built a criminal record heavy with armed robbery and narcotics offenses. But what really caught the Bureau's attention was his talent for getting out of places he wasn't supposed to leave. He'd escaped custody before. More than once. And that history is precisely what earned him a one-way ticket to Alcatraz in January of 1960, after fleeing a Louisiana penitentiary. The Bureau's logic was simple: if a man can't be contained by ordinary security, send him to the one place that supposedly contains everyone. It was, in hindsight, exactly the wrong move. Once inside, Morris found himself housed near a small cluster of men he already knew from earlier stretches behind bars: brothers John and Clarence Anglin, and a 4th inmate named Alan West. Their cells sat close enough together that, in the after-hours quiet, they could talk in low voices without guards noticing. That proximity became the seed of the entire plot. Morris, with his sharp intelligence and history of slipping past security, naturally became the one steering the plan. Where other escape attempts at Alcatraz had been desperate, spur-of-the-moment gambles, Morris wanted something closer to engineering. The team's target was almost absurdly mundane: the concrete behind the ventilation grates beneath their sink basins. Decades of salt air and moisture had quietly eaten away at the mixture, leaving it softer and more brittle than the prison's builders ever intended. Using stolen spoons, scavenged blade fragments, and a crude drill improvised from a vacuum cleaner motor, the men spent months chipping through that weakened concrete, a little at a time, night after night. To keep the sound from carrying, they timed their digging to the prison's music hour. When instruments were permitted, Morris's own wheezing accordion providing convenient cover for the scrape of metal against stone. To hide the growing holes from daytime inspection, they built fake vent covers out of painted papier-mâché, good enough to fool a guard glancing into a cell but not a hand actually reaching for it. This was not opportunism. This was design. While Morris supplied the intellect, John and Clarence Anglin supplied something just as essential: absolute loyalty forged over a lifetime. The brothers came from a large, poor farming family in rural Florida, one of 13 children raised to depend on each other because there often wasn't much else to depend on. That bond didn't disappear when they turned to crime. If anything, it hardened. Their specialty was bank robbery, and their shared talent for slipping out of custody eventually got them labeled repeat escape risks, which is how they ended up first at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta and, ultimately, at Alcatraz. When they landed on the Rock, they discovered Morris and Alan West already there, men they'd crossed paths with in earlier institutions. What started as a coincidence of scheduling became the backbone of a conspiracy. While Morris handled the technical planning, the Anglins threw themselves into labor and logistics, hollowing out the concrete alongside him, scavenging raincoats from the prison stores and laundry runs, and helping fashion one of the plan's strangest and most memorable inventions: a set of convincing dummy heads, sculpted from soap shavings, toilet paper, and real hair swept off the barbershop floor, then painted with stolen art supplies to mimic skin tone. Slipped under blankets during nightly bed checks, those heads were meant to buy the escapees precious hours before anyone realized their cells were empty. The brothers' fate after the escape has become one of the most contested threads in the entire case. Officially, the FBI closed its file in 1979 and declared all 3 men legally dead by drowning. Unofficially, the story never stopped growing. Relatives spoke of Christmas cards allegedly sent from the brothers years later. A grainy 1975 photograph, supposedly showing 2 men resembling John and Clarence standing together in Brazil, circulated for decades without ever being definitively authenticated or debunked. And in 2013, more than half a century after the escape, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department claiming to be from John Anglin himself, asserting that all 3 men had survived, that Morris and Clarence had since died of natural causes, and that John, now elderly and unwell, wanted to negotiate a surrender in exchange for medical care. 4 years, that letter sat in forensic limbo. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. No usable fingerprints or DNA could be tied to it. It was too plausible to dismiss and too unverifiable to confirm. The case in miniature. Every heist story needs the one who almost got away, and in this story, that role belongs to Alan West. West had been at Alcatraz since 1957 and had known both Morris and the Anglin brothers from earlier prison stints. When their cells ended up clustered together, he became the 4th member of the plot, contributing just as much sweat to the digging, the raft construction, and the fake vent covers as the others. But on the night it mattered most, West's hole simply wasn't finished. Whether he'd miscalculated the thickness of the remaining concrete or just run out of time, he found himself scraping frantically at the last few inches while the clock ran out. Morris and the Anglins couldn't afford to wait. With dawn approaching and the entire plan resting on darkness, they left without him. West was still in his cell the next morning when guards discovered the empty bunks and the eerie, lifelike dummy heads staring back at them. He cooperated fully with investigators afterward, walking them through the entire scheme: the tunnel route, the rooftop crossing, the intended landing point at Angel Island. His account became the backbone of the official investigation for years. And it's worth sitting with the strange shape of his fate. The one man who didn't escape is also the one man whose story we know isn't clouded by decades of myth. He served out his time and died a free man years later, having spent the rest of his life as the only living witness to a plan he helped build but never got to finish. However you feel about what happened after they left the island, there's no disputing the sheer inventiveness of how Morris and the Anglins actually got off it. Once through their tunnels, the men gained access to an unguarded utility corridor above the cell block, a byproduct of the prison's aging, poorly monitored infrastructure, and used it to reach a hidden workshop space where they could build without fear of a random head count catching them. There, over the following weeks, they assembled a plan for the water that was every bit as improvised as the tunnel itself. Working with more than 50 stolen raincoats, they stitched together a raft roughly 6 feet by 14 feet, sealing the seams by pressing melted rubber against the fabric using heat drawn from the prison's steam pipes. A modified concertina, essentially a small accordion, was converted into a hand-operated air pump to inflate the finished raft and matching life vests. Paddles were shaped from scrap plywood scavenged during work assignments. None of it looked like escape equipment. All of it worked because nobody was looking for it. On the night of June 11, 1962, the plan finally moved from theory to execution. Sometime in the half-hour before 11, the 3 men slipped from their cells, climbed the route they'd spent months preparing, and reached the island's edge. They inflated the raft and pushed off into the dark, aiming for Angel Island, less than 2 miles across open water. By morning, they were gone, and so, largely, was the evidence. Over the following days, a paddle turned up in the bay. A sealed packet containing personal items belonging to the Anglins washed ashore. A week later, fragments of the raft itself, along with a homemade life vest, were recovered near the Golden Gate Bridge. What never turned up was a body. Not one. For the prison's warden at the time, and for much of federal law enforcement, the absence of bodies wasn't a mystery. It was an expected outcome. The bay's currents were violent enough, cold enough, and unpredictable enough that officials assumed the men had simply been swept out to sea and lost. That assumption held for years, reinforced by the sheer improbability of anyone surviving prolonged exposure in 50-degree water. It was formalized in 1979, when the FBI officially closed its file and declared all 3 escapees legally dead. But an official declaration isn't the same as proof, and the case never really behaved like it was closed. Sightings were reported, then quietly dismissed. Letters and photographs surfaced periodically, each triggering a fresh round of speculation before fading back into uncertainty. The U.S. Marshal Service, which retained jurisdiction even after the FBI stepped back, kept the file technically open, a bureaucratic crack that true crime researchers and amateur investigators have been prying at for decades. In 2022, the Marshals released updated age-progressed images of what Morris and the Anglin brothers might look like today, an unusual move for a case most people assumed was ancient history. What kept the doubt alive wasn't sentiment. It was a nagging technical question nobody had ever properly answered. Given the currents on that specific night, was the crossing to Angel Island actually survivable? That question is where the 2025 developments come in, and it's worth being precise about what changed and why it matters. Rather than relying on generalized assumptions about the bay's currents, investigators working with updated tidal and hydrodynamic models were able to reconstruct the water conditions specific to the night of June 11, 1962, factoring in the moon phase, seasonal current patterns, and the timing window the escapees most likely used. Earlier tidal modeling work, first conducted by researchers in the Netherlands back in 2014, had already suggested that a raft launched in the narrow window around 11 p.m. could plausibly have ridden the current toward Angel Island rather than being pulled out toward the open Pacific. The 2025 reanalysis builds on that foundation with finer-grained data and modeling tools that simply didn't exist a decade earlier, sharpening the picture from theoretically possible to something closer to probable if executed with precision. Alongside the oceanographic work, investigators also returned to the physical evidence with modern forensic techniques, reassessing the recovered raft fragments, the personal effects found near the Anglin's packet, and yes, that long-contested 2013 letter. None of these individually amounts to a smoking gun. The letter still can't be definitively authenticated. The 1975 Brazil photograph remains just as ambiguous as it's always been. But taken together, the new analysis shifts the weight of probability. Investigators aren't claiming they've found the men, alive or dead. What they're saying is that the physical case for they couldn't possibly have survived, the bedrock assumption the entire official story rested on for 60 years, no longer holds up against the data. In other words, the mystery hasn't been solved in the way headlines like to promise. Nobody's produced a body, a fingerprint, or a definitive photograph. What's actually happened is quieter and, In some ways, more unsettling, a slow, methodical dismantling of the certainty that let the case be closed in the first place. For 60 years, they drowned was treated as fact. In 2025, it's been demoted to one possibility among several, and not even the most likely one anymore. It's worth stepping back and asking why 3 men who broke federal law in 1962 still command this much attention more than 60 years later. Part of it is the sheer craftsmanship of the escape itself, the dummy heads, the raincoat raft, the months of patient digging disguised by an accordion. It plays like a heist film because in a lot of ways it was assembled from prison scraps by men with nothing but time and desperation. But there's something deeper going on too. Alcatraz was built to be the final word on containment, proof that the system always wins, that there's no crack too small to seal. The idea that 3 men might have found the one crack the system missed, and lived long enough to disappear into ordinary life, is genuinely subversive. It's the same instinct that's kept stories like D.B. Cooper's Vanishing Act alive in the public imagination for decades, a fascination with the idea that the machinery of control isn't as absolute as it claims to be. And in an era of facial recognition, digital paper trails, and near-total surveillance, there's something almost mythic about the idea that 3 men slipped through in 1962 and simply were never found again. It doesn't fit the world we live in now, which is exactly why it still captures people who weren't even alive when it happened. So where does that leave things in 2026, a year removed from this reassessment? The U.S. Marshal Service still hasn't reopened active criminal proceedings. There's no one left to prosecute even if the men are found, and if they died decades ago, there's no crime scene left to process. What's changed isn't the legal status of the case. It's the epistemic one. The confident, closed-book version of the story, 3 inmates who tried something reckless and paid for it with their lives, no longer fits the evidence as neatly as it once did. What remains is something harder to package into a tidy conclusion, a case where the physical possibility of survival has been meaningfully strengthened, where key pieces of testimony can't be ruled out, and where the absence of bodies, after 6 decades of searching, has stopped looking like confirmation of drowning and started looking like something else entirely.